Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Haekyung An, Senior Advisor at KI. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Ambassador Marc Knapper, U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam. Our topic today is U.S., Korea, Vietnam Trilateral Cooperation. Last week, we had a very successful state visit by South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. During the summit, President Yoon and President Biden, they acknowledged the importance of Indo-Pacific voices, and then they agreed to expand the cooperation throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So I think our topic today is very timely, and then we are very extremely lucky to have Ambassador Knapper here in person. Ambassador Knapper has been representing the Vietnam since February 2022. And previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Korea and Japan. And he also served as Chargé d'Affaires, which means acting ambassador, at the U.S. Embassy Seoul for about 16 months. As a senior foreign service officer, he has many great diplomatic skills, but he's known as a genius in language. So he received the State Department's the Linguist of the Year Award for his very fluent Korean and Japanese. I can tell about his Vietnamese, but I'm sure he's pretty fluent too. So, and also, as many of you know, the Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, the KEI President CEO, and also former U.S. Ambassador to Korea, she's very fluent in Korean as well. So maybe you guys can speak in Korean for the discussion today. So we have lots of issues to cover today, and also, by the way, there will be a Q&A session at the end. So for those who are joining virtually, please post the questions in the chat box. So without any further ado, please join me welcoming Ambassador Knapper and also Ambassador Stephens. Thank you for moderating the conversation, and please take it from here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Haekyung, and hello to everybody. Welcome, and I guess I will say 환영합니다 to Ambassador Knapper, who is a great friend of KEI as well, and I want to thank him not only for coming today. I know you just got into Washington over the weekend, but for your great support for KEI over the years, in particular in the years when you were Deputy Assistant Secretary at State just before you went to Vietnam. We said we obviously we want to talk about Korea, Vietnam, and so we pose this as trilateral cooperation, but you really are, I have to say, Mr. Indo-Pacific, and maybe a little later in the conversation we can get into your career, because I know we have many people who listen online as well as here in the audience are very interested in careers, diplomatic careers, what it's like, and the nexus between language and diplomacy. You are certainly a great role model, and for that. But, you know, I also note, and we're not here to talk about, if we talked about your bio, we take up too much time, but you've also worked on China, India. I think you and I first met when you were Director for Indian Affairs. So I do want to talk in the Indo-Pacific context as well. But maybe to start, I know as you arrived, as Haekyung mentioned, obviously we had the state visit by President Yoon Suk-yeol last week. I'm sure you're watching that a bit. And I think this week, the President of the Philippines is here. And you've had some visitors in Vietnam as well. So we could start a lot of different places, but maybe since you are arriving here after having completed now about a year as ambassador in Vietnam, maybe to just welcome your sense about what's it like being in Vietnam, and what are you back for as well?
Okay, well, thanks, Kathy. Thank you, KEI. Thanks, Haekyung, for the great introduction. Always welcome the chance to come back and to visit with you all. Should acknowledge the presence of Ambassador Joseph Yoon, our very good Sunbae. Thanks, Joe, for joining as well. I mean, I've been in Vietnam now about a year and 2 or 3 months, and it's just been fascinating for me to see the growth in this relationship. Of course, having gone from a basis of virtually zero in 1995 when we normalized to where we are today is really remarkable. It's a remarkable story, I think, of hard work and goodwill on both sides of the ocean to take our relationship from where it was, having been combatants for so many years, and then of course a history from 75 to 95 of embargo, sanctions, isolation. But the efforts we've made to promote reconciliation, to promote friendship and understanding have been remarkable, and really thanks to folks in the United States like the late Senator John McCain, of course Senator John Kerry, folks like Senator Hagel, folks like Senator Patrick Leahy. These are all individuals who really did stake a lot of their careers on building this relationship. And they had counterparts, of course, in Vietnam who did the same, who believed in this relationship. And we've seen the fruits of their efforts and the efforts of many, many others, again, in Vietnam and in the United States. A relationship now that's, let's see, I think our two-way trade is now about $130 billion, making Vietnam the U.S.'s 8th largest trading partner, which is pretty amazing. The United States is Vietnam's #1 export market.
Wow.
We trade in many different things, from aircraft to machinery to, I mean, you name it. They're a huge market for our own agricultural goods. This is a relationship in which our cooperation in security, defense, law enforcement, people-to-people, education, I mean, you name it, we're doing it with Vietnam. Even we're doing outer space cooperation. Vietnam is now the 5th largest source of foreign students in the United States, after countries like India, China, South Korea, and Vietnam, of course, is in there as #5. And I think it says a lot about the stake that Vietnamese families are willing to put in their children's future in the American education system. And frankly, popularity is not the right word, but if we do polling, or someone does polling, and the results are 96% favorability of the United States in Vietnam, which is, again, a remarkable figure. The Peace Corps, which I know is near and dear to your heart. We now have Peace Corps volunteers since last December in Vietnam.
So just 5 months ago?
Just 5 months ago. That's right. They were sworn in late December.
Wow.
9 of them teaching English in the outskirts of Hanoi, but it's a program that will continue to grow. So, I mean, I could go on touting this relationship, but in many ways, we share strong interests, whether it's South China Sea and the ability, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, freedom from coercion. We share interests in terms of the Mekong River and how, whether it's Mekong-related law enforcement security issues, whether it's Mekong-related environmental issues. We share interests in an open global trading order, which isn't to say we don't have differences. We certainly do in areas like human rights and other things, but we handle those in a way that's always respectful, but also frank. So I find this relationship just going from strength to strength. As you said, we did have some visitors recently. Secretary Blinken was in town, and he...
That was 2 weeks ago, or?
I guess.
You can't, hard to say. Anyway.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. And he broke ground on what will be our new embassy there in Hanoi, which is...
Well, you're ahead of us in Seoul on that then.
I guess.
Anyway.
I have lost track of where that one is.
Left that one, right.
But no, it's just a relationship
amazing.
with virtually no limits, no ceiling, and it's really exciting to be there, an honor to be there now, serving as ambassador.
And you first served in Vietnam in what years you were telling me about?
I was there 2004 to 7.
So just 9 years after normalization.
That's right. So we commemorated the 10th anniversary of normalization while I was there. So yeah, it's changed so much in the 15 years since I left.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I kind of hate it when people ask me questions like this, but what would you say is the biggest change? Is it the economic change that's really transformed Vietnam and the relationship? Or?
The development, of course, it's impossible to miss how much it's grown and changed. I think that the relationship with the U.S. is fundamentally changed as well. Whereas 15 years ago, I mean, it took time to get things done there, but now I think things have sped up. I think we've built a pretty decent level of trust and a very decent level of friendship, and I think a very good understanding of each other and our shared interests. So that's a big change. And I think Vietnam's role regionally and globally even has increased. I mean, they're a leader within ASEAN. They played a significant role as ASEAN chair during a tough year, COVID year, 2020. They were on the UN Security Council, 2020, 2021. They've chaired APEC twice in 2006 and 2017. They've got peacekeepers now in South Sudan and Central African Republic.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so it's really a Vietnam that's increasingly present and active and playing. Providing, I think, a net security positive in the region.
So when President Biden talks about allies and partners, Vietnam is kind of in the top tier of partners, if not yet a formal ally, or I shouldn't say yet, because I might...
Well, there are certain...
constraints?
Constraints, I think, and Vietnam itself has imposed constraints. One is that they just will not ally with anyone. They practice a policy of being friends with everyone, enemies with none. But no, I think as partners go, they're among, as you said, the top ones in the Indo-Pacific. and we
But,
intend to keep it
yeah,
that way.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Korea-Vietnam relationship.
Yes.
I mean, you are uniquely well placed to witness that, and also the big changes in it. But if the U.S. and Vietnam normalized relations in 1995, so 20 years after the
That's right.
U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, it was the year I first arrived in Korea, actually. So we've seen a lot of history. When did South Korea normalize relations with Vietnam? Do you recall?
They just celebrated their 30th anniversary.
Their
so
30th.
93.
93, so a little bit before, yeah.
And a lot of countries actually are celebrating now their 50th anniversary. I mean, Japan just is celebrating this year its 50th anniversary. I'm sorry, actually Korea was 92. Last year was their 30th anniversary.
Okay, yeah. So at the same time, they normalized relations with China then.
That's right, that whole sort of...
But the South Korea-Vietnam relationship is, I mean, you mentioned exports. I mean, the Vietnam, I was surprised that Vietnam's #1 export market is the U.S. I'm guessing that a lot of those exports are made with some input from Korean companies.
That's right. And there's anecdotes that get tossed around, and I'm not sure how verifiable they are, but that Samsung occupies a huge chunk of Vietnam's GDP, for example. But of course, a lot of the inputs into what Samsung produces in Vietnam comes from South Korea, and it's assembled, packaged, tested, and then shipped to the United States. And so we have a very powerful sort of triangular trade relationship among our three countries, and Korean companies are great advocates alongside American companies for what we're trying to achieve there in Vietnam in terms of clean energy transition, in terms of critical minerals, rare earth minerals, that sort of thing. You've got U.S., Vietnamese, Korean, and Australian companies working together. So there's definitely, I think, in terms of U.S.-Korea collaboration in Vietnam, there's a lot going on, especially in terms of business.
And you see that on the ground there.
We do, and we meet regularly with our Korean embassy friends there in Hanoi. The relatively new Korean ambassador is a woman, Oh Young-ju. I don't know if you ever came across her. She's terrific, very active, works hard to promote Korea's interests. But again, so much of what we do in Vietnam is parallel to what South Korea is doing. Maritime domain awareness, for example. Both we and the Republic of Korea provide Vietnam with vessels, Coast Guard vessels, to be able to enhance their own capabilities to patrol and monitor their waters and their maritime interests.
That's not, at least I didn't know that. Yeah, and is that in a kind of a trilateral format, or these are kind of both just bilateral?
Just in parallel we do it, but it reflects,
Yeah.
I think, our shared interests between Washington and Seoul, and making sure that Hanoi has what it needs to defend, protect, monitor its interests in the South China Sea. Japan does similar things, Australia as well. But I think it just shows a really strong overlap in how Washington and Seoul view the importance of Vietnam, and how our collaborative efforts there do complement each other. Another interesting area is related to the war. I mentioned earlier reconciliation efforts the U.S. has undertaken since the early 90s, since even before normalization. One of them has included accounting for missing U.S. service members, which of course has been foundational to our relationship in eventual normalization. But another is cleaning up unexploded ordnance, cleaning up dioxin, Agent Orange hotspots, and then assisting people with disabilities, whether those disabilities came from unexploded ordnance, dioxin, or other causes. And so COICA is very active in Vietnam on demining and ordnance cleanup activities. And so the State Department, along with COICA, UNDP, the Norwegians, we have a multilateral, multinational effort underway in central Vietnam, which is where most of the heaviest bombing and heaviest sort of fighting took place, and where the largest patches of ground that still have unexploded ordnance remain. So it's an effort that we very much appreciate the Korean government's work on.
And COICA, is the Korean Foreign Assistance, Development Assistance Agency, but it also is involved in this area of exploited. I'm just curious, is USAID kind of our agency? This is a bit of a wonky question, but it is, yeah.
Sure, and AID is very involved. In fact, Vietnam is one of USAID's largest partner countries.
In Vietnam?
In this part of the world, yeah.
Interesting.
That part of the world, I should say.
Yeah.
But in what, and there is a development nexus because a lot of the land that is eventually cleared becomes farmland again. And so you've got now coffee, cacao, other crops that are grown on formerly unarable land, land that just couldn't be utilized because of the unexploded ordnance that remained in the soil. And so it allows farmers to increase their crops, and it allows just local communities to increase their income. So it definitely there is a development angle.
I'm interested in, again, this is looking a little bit more historically, but again, you have the kind of background to do this, and you talked about the sort of decades-long reconciliation process between Vietnam, unified Vietnam, and the United States. What about, Korea and Vietnam, to me, I'm a bit of a history buff, are kind of fascinating because they seem to have a lot of parallels, both in their, if you like, their long history in terms of being proud and as cultures and very distinct cultures and entities with a national identity, distinct from China, but very influenced and always within that orb in some way in terms of managing all that. And then, of course, a very challenging 20th century, I guess we could say, in both ways. And then, of course, you have South Korea's participation in the war in Vietnam. So you've mentioned some of those efforts now, but that's getting more attention actually in South Korea now as well. But do you find, and this is a bit of a kind of just a more general question, which I know maybe as ambassador it's a little harder to answer, but what is there a sense of commonality or tensions, would you say, at kind of the cultural and the people-to-people level between, Vietnamese and Koreans? South Koreans are there in such a big way in terms of the economy, but I also understand, for example, that, K-pop,
Yep.
K-culture is very, very popular. Right. It's popular everywhere, is it not? But, could you just say a little bit about that? I'm curious how it kind of feels to you as you see it on the ground there, what the potential or if there are tensions there.
So I'll go back again to my experience 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Used to turn on sort of Vietnamese public national broadcasts, and there would often be Korean dramas which were being aired with Vietnamese either dubbing or subtitles. And I recall at the time speaking with a Korean embassy friend of mine who said, "Oh yeah, we provide the shows. We, the Korean government, provide the shows and the subtitles for free because it was a way to introduce to Vietnamese people Korean culture, but also Korean products. And so those Hyundai automobiles or Samsung washing machines or whatever that people would see on the screen would eventually find their way into the Vietnamese market. And so that was, I think, a very early foray by Korean companies working in hand with Korean sort of cultural ministry to bring Korean culture, soft power, to Vietnam. And at that time, I remember, the Japanese were a much more visible presence in terms of factories and just expat population. Now it's completely reversed. There's, I want to say 400,000 Koreans now living.
And fewer Japanese.
Well, still a lot.
Still a lot,
But fewer. And you can't go anywhere without seeing Korean large companies, small companies, medium-sized companies that have set up shop there. And Samsung employs 110,000 people, which is a remarkable figure.
Wow.
All direct. These aren't contractors; these are direct Samsung employees. And so Korea's done very well. Sort of doubled down, went all in on its investments in Vietnam. So you've got name brand Vietnamese or Korean companies like Samsung, Lotte, Hyosung. They're all there in a big way. LG, Hyundai, and so they do quite well. And I think again, I'm hesitant to sort of I can speak about favorability when it comes to the U.S., but I think if you were to do polls, I think Korea would still rank very high because of not just the economic benefits that come from Korean investment, but also I think this soft power aspect, as you said, K-power, K-pop, K-dramas, K-beauty, all those sorts of things.
It is kind of a remarkable thing. I'm recalling, I can't help telling a little bit of a story from when I was ambassador in Seoul a decade or, I always have to get that phrase in there somewhere, about now more than a decade ago. I knew the Vietnamese ambassador to Seoul. And he spoke excellent Korean, much, much better than my Korean, just like your better. It was so good. But we spoke to each other in Korean because he actually didn't speak English very well. And so we had these, as you often do in a foreign language, these very frank conversations, because sometimes in a foreign language you have to, when each is a foreign language for each person, you can be very direct. And I remember But him telling me about his background, and he had learned Korean at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang. And he had been an interpreter for Kim Il-sung himself, actually, and had amazing stories, which I won't repeat here, of those early days. But North Korea and Vietnam had a very important relationship for a long time. And what I hear you describing, and I think is a relationship where the relationship with South Korea has become the predominant relationship. But how does Vietnam manage that, if I may ask? And does that impose any complexities in terms of of the relationships that Vietnam itself is now cultivating with South Korea and with the broader Indo-Pacific community?
So, of course, as you said, I mean, Vietnam has had a long-standing relationship dating back to decades, and but you definitely hear more there about the relationship with South Korea than you do about than one does about the relationship with North Korea. I think COVID shut down a lot of the sort of traditional channels of contact for at least 2-3 years. I mean, as we all know, I mean, North Korea was really shut down during COVID, and I think to the point where new ambassadorial postings weren't being filled in Pyongyang because individuals just couldn't travel there. And so I think the friendship between and the relationship between the two governments, between the two parties, between the Communist Party of Vietnam and the Korean Workers' Party, I think, which has always been a pretty strong pipeline, and was also chosen by. So to be honest, and I don't claim to know everything about everything that's going on, but don't see a lot of North Koreans around town from the diplomatic circuits. Not that I'm peering at everybody's lapels to try and see who's who.
Right. Yeah. So again, we kind of phrase this trilateral cooperation. Whoops. Slight technical adjustment.
Okay, no worries. Yeah. We got disconnected here.
Whoops. Well, maybe that allows us to make a little bit of a transition too into so we kind of phrase this, and you've talked a bit about, I mean, clearly the important triangular, if you like, business ties and if you like, kind of cultural ties as well between the U.S. and Vietnam. But I want to back up a little bit and get your sense about how this idea of the Indo-Pacific is playing in Vietnam. And again, I feel like you're a perfect person to ask this because you have served in every part of the Indo-Pacific, if you like, really, from Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia to actually South Asia when you worked on India. And I would say it's certainly kind of asymmetric. Obviously, even when we talk about allies and partners, different roles for different people. But what do you think are the parts of, if you like, the Indo-Pacific framework that appeals most to Vietnam, and where in particular does, if at all, does Korea is a really important economic partner, and in many ways, you say, with these other kind of soft ties too, what role can it play within the Indo-Pacific?
So, is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So if you look at the, sorry, I sort of go into like talking head mode here, but if you look at the Biden administration,
I need to stop you from doing that.
The 5 sort of main pillars of the Indo-Pacific strategy are promotion of a free and open Indo-Pacific, connectivity, regional connectivity through regional organizations like ASEAN, promotion of prosperity, strengthening security, and building resilience, whether it's resilience against climate change or resilience against global pandemics, supply chain resilience. And so we like to say, when we look at our approach to Vietnam is kind of a microcosm of our larger Indo-Pacific strategy, because all
she's bringing you another, so I'm sorry.
One more mic.
No worries.
It's mine that should break down, not yours.
No problem. Is that good? Okay. So yeah, Vietnam in some ways is a microcosm of our approach to the Indo-Pacific, because when we talk with Vietnam, we talk all the time about our shared interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific, which we approach through efforts to strengthen their maritime capabilities, strengthen their Coast Guard. We've given them 2 high-endurance Coast Guard cutters, which are big ships. I mean, these aren't like little PT boats. I mean, these are gigantic Coast Guard vessels, and a 3rd one is on the way. We talk about connectivity through organizations like APEC, EAS, the ARF, ASEAN, of course, and again, Vietnam is central to all of these. Promotion of prosperity through efforts like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which Vietnam was a founding or charter member back in May of last year. Promotion of security, again, getting to our shared interests in South China Sea that's free from coercion, that has freedom of overflight, freedom of navigation. Again, the Mekong River, another key element that Vietnam looks at in terms of transnational issues, whether it's trafficking in persons, narcotics trafficking, wildlife trafficking. These are all areas we work very closely with them and other governments to combat. And then resilience, whether it's the fight against COVID, which we in Vietnam engaged in very closely. We supplied 40 million vaccines to Vietnam.
Really?
We effectively vaccinated 1/5.
The U.S. did? I don't think people know that.
Yeah, it's remarkable. We basically were helped vaccinate 1/5 of the population there, of 100 million people. But it wasn't just one way. When we needed it most, if you remember back in the spring of 2020, when things were bad here, Vietnam supplied us with hundreds of millions of masks and going on PPE, the garments, gowns. So we really did help each other in that time. Climate change resilience, another area we're working very closely with them. John Kerry has been very active in working on energy transition, clean energy transition, whether it's wind or solar or biomass. And then, of course, supply chain resilience, working with American companies who are interested in moving into Vietnam, or companies that are in other countries interested in moving into Vietnam. And so these are all areas, again, part of the larger Indo-Pacific strategy, but that fits perfectly, like a perfect overlay with our approach to Vietnam. And I think the Indo-Pacific strategy was very, I think, warmly welcomed there in Hanoi. All of our conversations show a real depth of understanding and large interest, heavy interest in what we're trying to achieve. A lot of interest in the Quad and AUKUS. And so these are all areas we work very closely with them to help the government understand what we're trying to achieve, and that these are efforts, AUKUS, the Quad, to complement ASEAN, not supersede it or overshadow it. And as for Korea, I mean, it's interesting, when we were talking about IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, last April-ish, Korea and Japan were early advocates of the IPEF, and really were partners with us in trying to work with partner governments in the region, whether it was Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, on the merits of this. And so I recall working closely with my counterparts in the Korean and Japanese embassies on approaches to try and secure, eventually successfully, Vietnam's decision. But I think it was, a good decision, and they've been very active, very, very enthusiastic participants so far. And so we've been very grateful for their participation. And Korea, of course, with its own, and forgive me, I don't know the name of their recent strategy, Indo-Pacific Strategy.
It is the Indo-Pacific Strategy, I think. Yeah,
okay.
right?
But yeah, I think it does complement very well. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the previous Korean administration's New Southern Policy,
Right,
and which I think very much focused on Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and then I believe Bangladesh and India. But these are all, I mean, there's a thread, I think, running through both American and Korean, South Korean administrations, whether in our case Democratic or Republican, in their case, conservative progressive governments that really do recognize the importance of Southeast Asia in general, and Vietnam in particular, to whether it's U.S. national interests or South Korean national interests. And it's something that it's very fertile ground for both Washington and Seoul to work on together, and it's certainly something my Korean counterpart, South Korean counterpart, and I worked very closely on together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this investment that we've seen move to Vietnam, as you've mentioned, but I mean, not only from South Korea but throughout, is pretty extraordinary. Yeah. In fact, it gets into another area which is very much in the U.S.-Korea bilateral relationship now, and that, of course, is the move towards implementing and defining economic security, and rearranging supply chains, of which, of course, Vietnam is very much a part. And I actually heard that, and I didn't know this, maybe you knew that, there's a Vietnamese electric vehicle producer, of course, Korea's big one, VinFast,
Yes.
that is shipping will be shipping cars to the U.S. So I'd love to hear about that, but also I want to hear, I mean, do they pay attention to things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, and that must all have an impact on Vietnam and its industrial policy as well, right? And I'm curious how that conversation is going.
So yes, last year VinFast, which is a subsidiary of Vietnam's largest company called Vin Group, which in some ways is how can I say is a good comparison to Chaebol in South Korea, a large group with a lot of different components, whether hospitality, retail, manufacturing, you name it. But VinFast did announce a $4 billion investment in North Carolina to build electric vehicles and electric batteries for those cars. 6,000 plus jobs, which is terrific news for that state, and I think it's a real vote of confidence in the American workers, but also a real boost, I think, to our own electric future, our own clean energy future in the United States. But I also like to look at it. I think if you look at the examples of sort of Japanese investment in the United States or Korean investment in the United States, I mean, what typically followed these major investments were stronger people-to-people ties and stronger political ties. And I think, at least my hope is that the more Vietnamese investment we see in the United States, with that will come just bridges that are built naturally between communities, between educational institutions, between elected representatives. And so I'm very hopeful that with that we'll see even greater and stronger bridges. I mean, we already have between the U.S. and Vietnam very strong people-to-people connections through the very active Vietnamese diaspora in the U.S., 2+ million people who contribute every day to building understanding between our two countries. And so with investment from Vietnam, I think we'll see that kind of understanding and mutual sort of reliance even grow even more. But yes, to the second part of your question, great deal of interest in the Inflation Reduction Act and its implications for electric vehicles and batteries. Certainly heard a lot about it when I was there. I probably shouldn't get into too much more detail on that one. But also, yeah, CHIPS Act for sure, a lot of interest in what does it mean for Vietnam's own desire to move up the value chain in terms of what it can actually manufacture there. And how does it sort of move from assembly, packaging, and testing to actually, the manufacture of some of these highest of the high-tech components that are the commodities, the new sort of oil of the 21st century. But actually, just to answer, the point you mentioned at the very beginning, why am I here this week? Why am I here? And one of them is to participate in an event called Select USA, which is the U.S. Department of Commerce's sort of premier event to welcome potential investors from overseas to the United States. And so we've got a large delegation of Vietnamese companies that are interested in investing here. And so I'm leading that delegation, and we'll be participating in this conference in the next few days, introducing these investors to state governments, municipal governments, state economic development organizations, and hopefully, again, build in Vietnamese investment that will create jobs and I think promote even stronger ties between our two countries.
Yeah, and I should know this, but I don't. Is Vietnam signed up for the CPTPP?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, they are.
Another interesting topic to discuss. But yeah, they're very active within CPTPP.
And another topic, which is maybe a little sensitive, but obviously one that we that's very much out there. And how does Vietnam manage its relationship with China? It's gotten more challenging for everybody, and obviously Vietnam in some ways has been a beneficiary, at least it looks from the outside, of some of the desire for international companies, American companies, Korean companies, everywhere to reduce their exposure in China, to look to other places to invest, like Vietnam. Is there a downside for Vietnam?
So, I mean, China, like every other country in the region, Vietnam looks at China as one of its. I mean, I think actually China is Vietnam's #1 trading partner. South Korea is second, and of course a tremendous reliance
In overall volume,
right,
you were saying
two-way.
export to the U.S., but two-way with
Two-way with China is
right.
its #1 partner. So obviously, great deal of reliance on that market. And this is why during COVID, for example, it was such a shock to the Vietnamese economy to have the normal sort of trucks carrying fruit and vegetables and other agricultural goods, other commodities, were stopped at the border. I mean, they couldn't enter China, they couldn't sell their goods, and so that was a real hit to Vietnam's economy, not being able to export to China over land that way. Of course, the relationship between the two parties has been close and longstanding between the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Party of Vietnam. The party secretary of Vietnam, Mr. Nguyen Phu Trong, was the first visitor to Beijing after the party congress last October. And so, yeah, very close ties between the two. But obviously, there are also certain tensions, for example, in the South China Sea, involving what we and Vietnam both consider to be excessive, illegal Chinese claims in the South China Sea, and concerns about what's going on in some of the Mekong neighbors with certain investments. And so yeah, it's a relationship that has certain, I think, positive qualities, but also challenges, which, as you said, all of us work to manage. But with Vietnam, I think we do see very close, very eye to eye when it comes to what's happening in the South China Sea.
Yeah, you've mentioned the South China Sea several times, and that's been an area, I mean, it was again getting into the trilateral cooperation, but South China Sea has been an area where I think South Korea has been a little bit hesitant about getting involved and seeing its security challenges, obviously, in the north, and just a different kind of set of priorities, if you like. We've seen rhetorically from South Korea some changes in terms of being more forthright, as I think the thread is seemed to have sharpened. And you mentioned and said I didn't know about that, but South Korea actually doing some, I don't know if it's not secret, obviously you're telling us about it, but a fairly quiet cooperation on the Coast Guard front and so on. Do you see this as an area where, obviously the South China Sea is very important to trade and economic survival, really, for South Korea as well? Would Vietnam like to see South Korea be more active in that area?
I would have to say yes. I mean, I think any sort of cooperation between and among countries like Vietnam, the U.S., South Korea, Australia, Japan, India, to promote a South China Sea that's free and open, and to allow Vietnam to increase its own capabilities and to defend its interests, natural resources, whether it's fishing areas or resources in its EEZ or its continental shelf. These are important capabilities for them to develop, whether it's through they call it maritime domain awareness, which is everything from radars to drones to vessels, but something that we all together, U.S., South Korea, Japan, we're all working together. If not explicitly, it's certainly in a way it's sort of implicit and hopefully complements each other. But I think all this kind of effort for sure is welcome, and something we here in Washington definitely want to continue to pursue, because it's a net security plus for us as well. And I think we benefit greatly from Vietnam having the capability to protect its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and really defend its independence.
It's a long coastline.
It is.
I'm going to tell the audience I'm going to turn to you for some questions, and I know we're going to have some questions online as well, but I wanted to ask for your thoughts on one more thing, and I hope if we have a little time at the end we can talk a little bit about how you got into diplomacy and all these interesting assignments you've had. Not to talk about every single one, that's a lot, but you really do have a kind of an extraordinary experience already, and more to come. But what I wanted to ask you about was something I've heard over the years from Korean counterparts, and that is that they feel like Korea's development experience, both economically, they don't talk so much on the political side. Obviously, Vietnam is not a path to what we would call democratization, I guess, but on the economic side, in terms of economic development, that Korea has seen itself as a model with some very practical lessons as well as offer countries like Vietnam. Do you, and when you look at KOICA programs and others, do you see some potential there? Are there areas where Korea can play a particular role, or maybe shouldn't? I mean, for example, the Semal program, which I saw in Korea way back in the 1970s of attention to rural areas. Are there things there that are useful? I mean, we way back in the day, the American experience was the right one for everyone. There's part of the Korean experience that brings a different perspective. You look skeptical.
No. I'm actually just trying to.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with a now retired but former senior, very senior Vietnamese official, and we were just discussing Vietnam's development experience compared to other countries, and the subject of South Korea came up. And he told me that the leader he really admired was Park Chung-hee, and which struck me, as given that Park Chung-hee, of course, was the leader who oversaw the deployment of South Korean troops to Vietnam during the war. But his point was and I guess this is debatable, and I'm not an expert, but his view was that Park Chung-hee's government, successive administrations, the 60s and 70s, did a pretty good job picking winners, whether it was steel or shipbuilding or automobiles, eventually consumer electronics, semiconductors, and on and on. And I guess his point, this Vietnamese gentleman's point, was that, how can Vietnam do better at sort of engaging all the levers, tools of government, private sector, state-owned enterprises, whatever, to pick winners and help grow Vietnam's overall economy. So I thought that was an interesting, just one lesson, and certainly pitfalls, of course, because the attempt to pick winners doesn't always work. But I think if you focus on the ones that did ship, steel, cars, obviously something went right, and so that's something Vietnam looks very closely at. And rural development, also a significant aspect of what Vietnam's undertaking now, whether it's building roads. Thousands and thousands of kilometers of new highways being built. In the north, especially in the highlands, which previously had been inaccessible, areas in which ethnic minority groups live. And now they have access to resources and promoting things like ecotourism, promoting there's now kind of a flourishing of interest in different ethnic minority groups and their different customs and traditions, and that's become a tourist draw in places like Sapa and others in the northern highlands, which previously it was an overnight train ride and then a 2-hour car ride to get to some of these places. Now it's a 4-hour day trip on a superhighway.
And I would imagine Korean and Japanese tourism is, those markets are important.
Very, and at one point, before COVID, I think Da Nang alone, which is the beach community in central Vietnam, had 60 flights a day coming in from South Korea.
Wow.
Charter flights, and mostly. But and I remember there's a beautiful kind of hill town called Dalat, which is in the Central Highlands, an old French colonial, summer vacation resort. And I was there in August during peak sort of South Korean vacation season, when virtually every single person in the hotel in which I was staying I was South Korean.
Wow. Yeah.
It was just me and the Vietnamese waiters were the only ones who were not South Korean that particular day.
So you had to do some interpreting between Vietnamese and Korean.
But it's remarkable, just the back and forth between the two countries.
Yeah, that is amazing.
And you talk to, this gets back to your question about shared, what is it between the two? And you'll have anthropologists, others, I guess, tell you better than I could about this sort of shared kind of Confucian identity that links these Northeast Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, with Vietnam, and sort of sets Vietnam apart from its Southeast Asian neighbors.
Yeah. And maybe also that sense of, both Vietnam and Korea being substantial entities, but nonetheless small in the context of a large China. So having to have that determination, if you like, or development of identity. Maybe I'm being too much of an anthropologist here too, to maintain that identity.
And equal pride in having defended and strengthened this identity over thousands. Literally centuries, but in some cases over 1,000 years.
Yeah. On the building of the infrastructure, who's funding that? Vietnam didn't take Belt and Road money, did they?
No, they haven't. So a lot of it is, some of it is development. So either it's the South Korean development assistance, Australia, Japan provides quite a bit, but a lot of it's just self-generated. From Vietnamese exports, they keep a very low, deliberately keep their debt to GDP ratio very low, just to maintain their flexibility and sort of independence. But but through their exports, through hard currency they generate, they're able to fund a lot of these projects. But ways to go. I mean, whether it's transitioning from coal to renewables, that's a challenge for everybody. I think port and rail infrastructure is something they're very focused on. Building more ports, building a high-speed rail system is a huge project that's on the horizon. But these are all efforts that partners in places like Japan, South Korea, and others, the United States, can help with.
There's so much I want to ask you about Vietnam, but I realize we're supposed to talk about Korea too. But I need to take care of our audience. So let's. Did I see a hand here? Yes.
Stanley Kober. When I see that sign, Alliance for the Future, I can't help thinking of an alliance from the past, especially since we're talking about Vietnam. CETO doesn't exist anymore. Does that foreshadow the future of this alliance, given the growing tensions with China? What is the potential for the development of this alliance, the danger that history could repeat itself?
So do you mean the development of the U.S. ROK alliance, or?
Trilateral, we're talking about trilateral.
No talk at the moment of trying to grow, either do a repeat of CETO or to try and grow the U.S. ROK alliance in that way. But as we've talked about, certainly there are efforts underway in which U.S. and the ROK share a goal for a Vietnam that's more capable in terms of its capabilities to defend its maritime interests. So these aren't alliance activities per se, but it definitely reflects the shared goals, not just of Washington and Seoul, but of Tokyo, Canberra, New Delhi, and others to ensure that Vietnam and others in the region, not just Vietnam, but Philippines, Malaysia, have the resources they need to defend their interests within their waters.
If I could just add too, I mean the 70 years of the alliance is marking the signing of the bilateral mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Republic of Korea in 1953. And that mutual defense treaty, which has lasted for 70 years, and I think has broadened and deepened, and that was the subject of a lot of the discussions last week when President Yoon was in town, I mean, clearly has had to adapt and will continue to adapt to the challenges and the changes we see. But even in that treaty in 1953, it said it envisions a time of a kind of a multilateral, I mean, the U.S. has been trying to kind of foster multilateral ties in the region, I mean, since the end of World War II and since the end of the Korean War. And CETO, as you say, was one of those efforts which did not work. But what we do have now is ASEAN, which again is not an alliance, of which the US is not a member, of which Korea is not a member, but which both are involved in. So I think we see over the decades, and I think it will continue, an effort to foster different kinds of multilateral cooperation, and not necessarily just one group, or just bilateral or just multilateral. And I think we're still, I don't want to say at the beginning, but still very much in the midst of, and that will continue to change and develop, I think. But yeah, it is kind of remarkable to think that within our lifetimes, we are where we are today, I suppose you could say, with respect to U.S. relations with Vietnam, and for that matter, South Korea's.
Well, I mean, I'll just, indulge me with a personal story. My, father fought in Vietnam, 1966-67, with the Marines, and to have gone from, in one generation, from a combatant, combat veteran to now the U.S. ambassador to Hanoi, I think says a lot just about how far we've come as two nations. This journey we've taken together, it's pretty cool. In fact, my grandmother, so not my father's side, but my mother's mother lived in Saigon during the war as well, and my son, of course, lived in Vietnam. So 4 generations of my family have lived in Vietnam,
Yeah.
and so it's
Pretty deep.
yeah, it's
I was also struck when you said that the Vietnamese community in the United States is about 2 million people. That's about the same size as the estimated Korean community here. Interesting, how important world. Ambassador Yoon.
It always makes me nervous when Joe has a question.
Softball, yeah. So last time I went to Korea, I went to rural area, and it seems like a lot of Korean young men are getting married to Vietnamese women. and it's not just few, but quite a lot. Do you hear any of that? And what effect is it having on Vietnam? I mean, certainly, I think in Korea it's having a good effect.
Yeah, and I think, it's not just, as far as I know, in the countryside there, well, it's not just South Korea. You see this in the countryside in Japan as well. A lot of,
Really? I didn't know that.
a lot of, not just Vietnamese either. Other countries, I think from PRC as well, other Southeast Asian nations. And I think it's something the Korean embassy in Hanoi follows very closely. They work very closely with the Vietnamese foreign ministry to ensure that Vietnamese women who are now living in South Korea, make sure they're doing okay. And I think the remittances and other things it generates is quite significant. And I think just, again, the sort of bridges that are being built are also help to promote greater understanding between South Korea and Vietnam. But it is, I don't have the exact figures, but it's a pretty large number.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me over the years in South Korea is that, South Korea is, notably been such ethnically so homogeneous and so proudly so. But unlike in most countries, the countryside is more ethnically diverse than the cities. You go into a town. We bicycle through a lot of these towns, but yeah, you meet mixed families. It's really, yeah.
The Vietnamese men feeling a little bit left out.
You're gonna have to ask them, Joe.
What is actually? What's the population trend in Vietnam? It's not. It's still a growing. It doesn't. It's not on the demographic cliff like the.
No,
not at all.
So I think Vietnam was estimated to hit 100 million people in April.
Wow.
And what are the figures? Like 40% of the population's under 25.
Wow.
70% of the population's under 40.
It's very young.
Yeah. And so, and you see it, you feel it.
Yeah.
Out on the streets, just young people on motorbikes, all hours. It's really, it's an energizing place to be regardless. But just to see so many young people, so many kids running around, and then to visit like other countries in the region, in Northeast Asia, will remain unnamed. It's a very stark difference in just the street life.
Interesting. Yes, Sang.
We have an online question from YouTube. So, do you see a possibility of strengthening U.S. ROK Vietnam cooperation around nuclear energy, specifically SMR development?
It's a good question.
Small nuclear reactors
right.
that we're talking about.
Small modular reactor. Yeah, small modular reactor. So I might need to get fact checked on this, but as far as I know right now, nuclear power remains inaccessible in Vietnam for legal reasons. I think after Fukushima, I think there was many countries.
For Vietnamese legal reasons,
Right. Not for sanctions or other reasons, but I believe that post Fukushima there was a law passed that made it quite difficult. But I think SMRs remain an area of great interest to Vietnam and to companies, South Korean companies. I know they're looking hard at the Vietnamese market. I know of some Korean energy companies that are very interested in working with USVietnam on SMRs. So
for installation in Vietnam
Right.
to address,
right.
'cause Vietnam has a huge climate change vulnerability, right?
we say they say it's among the fifth, among the top 5 most vulnerable countries in the world, although Vietnam is not a huge emitter in the grand scheme of things, but nonetheless they do recognize the need to move from coal to something, whether it's wind energy, potentially SMRs, wind, solar, SMRs, you name it, ammonia, hydrogen, all these still untested technologies. But for now, I think nuclear power is not an option at the present time.
Tammy.
Thank you. Ambassador Knapper, we're beginning to see American and South Korean companies do joint ventures in areas like batteries. Are you seeing any U.S. ROK, do in third countries like Vietnam? Are you seeing joint venture activity?
In terms of specifically batteries or just
Batteries or anything? I'm just curious about I think there's great complementarity among our companies.
So, I guess the example, not so much JVs, although I could be wrong, and I'll have to get back to you if I can do some more research. But I mean, but you do see, as we talked about earlier, for example, manufacture of Galaxy smartphones in Vietnam, which are then exported to the U.S. Samsung executive once told me that 70% of the Samsung phones sold in the U.S. are made in Vietnam, which is pretty remarkable. A company like Hillsung makes ATMs in Vietnam, the majority of which are exported to the U.S. to U.S. Banks like Wells Fargo or Citibank or whatever. So you do see that sort of Korean manufacturing in Vietnam that winds up here in the United States. But JVs...
It's coming. If you're not seeing it yet, it's
Okay. No, well, thanks. And it would be, as you said, I think there's great complementarity there. I mean, we do see it. I mean, a really interesting case, not South Korea, but for example, Boeing, of course, has a very strong and long-standing relationship with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Nagoya, Japan. And Mitsubishi Heavy Industries has subcontracts with a number of SMEs, Vietnamese, American, and others in Vietnam, making sort of tier 3, tier 2 parts that eventually wind up, I mean, it's an amazing sort of supply chain. It makes its way to Wichita, Kansas, which then gets back to Nagoya, which then ends up in Everett, Washington for eventual assembly in a 737. So you do see this kind of supply chain and joint cooperation. And there's an American company in Da Nang that makes about 3,000 or 4,000 parts for 737, which, in case you're wondering, amounts to 0.5% of 737's total parts. I mean, it's like 500,000 components that go into 737, but they're being made in Vietnam now. Again, as part of this supply chain that Mitsubishi and Boeing are a part of. It's pretty fascinating.
That's amazing. Yeah, Andy, did you make this maybe the last one, unless we have one online?
Andy Hong, KEI. Thank you again, Ambassador Knapper, for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I just wanted to ask you briefly about how South Korean arms exports have been in the news, of course, for providing security to Europe. Of course, as you mentioned, South Korea has been providing things like surface combatants to Vietnam, as you mentioned, with Coast Guard cutters. And now Vietnam has traditionally imported from Russia for a lot of its heavier units, but now it seems like there's a space for South Korea to fill not just the market gap, but with increasing Chinese assertiveness, a capability gap as well, especially in the South China Sea. So could you speak a little bit to how, if there's an interest in Hanoi in diversifying their security, and if so, what role that South Korean arms exporters could do to step in and fill that gap? Thank you.
Thanks. It's a good question. And it's last December, Vietnam hosted its first ever defense trade show. And it was pretty remarkable. I mean, it was, first of all, extremely well organized, extremely well run over a few days, in which you had, like any other arms show, I guess, or trade show. I mean, booths. So we had several American companies were there. You had a lot of Australian companies, Indian companies, Russian companies. But I think it did reflect, and it's not a secret. I mean, Vietnam's own desire to diversify, modernize its defense equipment. And, of course, the point I made in some interviews at the time was that the U.S., we want U.S. firms to be a part of this effort to help Vietnam increase its capabilities while diversifying its sources. And as, of course, as the American ambassador, I can't really tout South Korean products, but I'm sure there's space in there somewhere for others.
Interoperability.
Right. Or, I don't know, like there's licensed things, that started off in the U.S. But I definitely think there's, there will be opportunities for many other countries' defense firms to be able to take part in this effort to diversify, globalize, modernize. But of course, we want, United States contractors to be front and center.
I have a ton more questions for you, but I know we're coming to the end of the hour, and I did want to leave a moment to again highlight, I think, what is the really extraordinary career that you've had and that you continue to lead on so many issues. But one thing that is very remarkable, and Hae-Kyung mentioned it in the in her introduction, is that not only have you served in around the Indo-Pacific, whether working on it from Washington or in the field, You've also learned the languages, and you've studied, I guess, and not only studied, but actually managed to figure out how to use what the State Department considers to be super hard languages: Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean. So my question is really, and is how important do you think learning foreign languages is? Kind of a pop-up for you to a diplomat, especially in the age of AI. You know, I mean, you know, you can go to Google Translate, and I haven't even figured out how to use GPT yet, and just push a button, and bam, it happens. I mean, why should, you know, do you feel like all those years you spent studying those languages have been, you know, years you could have been doing something else?
My misspent youth.
And what's your advice for young people?
Stay in school, don't do drugs. No, I mean, I'm very proud of the time and effort and energy and tears I put into learning, you know, these languages. And I don't think, what was it that Edward R. Murrow said about public diplomacy? The last 3 feet.
The last 3 feet,
like and
that's right. About this.
Yeah, and you can't get that
Yeah.
without having that cultural understanding, that linguistic understanding that comes from actually embracing, absorbing, and being able to speak these languages. So I mean, I'm a big proponent of foreign language study. You know, at one point, I know there was an effort. Well, I think I should be careful how I put this, but within the Foreign Service to downgrade the importance of reading capability versus speaking. And frankly, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think reading is as important as speaking, because I don't think you can be a good language speaker unless you can also read. And so I think for young people interested in this kind of career, absolutely foreign languages are critical. And there's just nothing more fun than being able to really live in a foreign country, as you know, to be able to have that language and interact without the aid of your smartphone.
When
makes
you
a
don't
difference.
have that, it's like you've lost a couple of your sentences. I mean, when I'm in countries where, it's hard. So, well, thank you for that, and thank you for all you do. All the best.
I appreciate being here. Thank you very much.
Yeah.